Hello, in today's video I wanted to teach you a method for keeping track of your story called outlining as you write. Outlining as you go is a writing strategy introduced to me by Dean Wesley Smith in his book Writing into the Dark. Essentially what it does is it helps you keep track of what you write as you're writing. Anyone who's finished a book knows and is probably familiar with the problems of remembering everything that you write down. In my case, the first time I wrote a book, I had written in several notebooks sort of outlining the story, what I wanted to do, and then I sat down and wrote it, expanded, changed things. But then at the very end, when it came down to doing the revision, I didn't have a detailed roadmap of everything that I had created, and it kind of created a monumental task to remember, which chapters I introduced certain characters and their descriptions and making things consistent. So I ended up creating this process. And now every time I write, every chapter, I outline as I go. How to outline as you write. There's a few simple steps. And you're going to want to do this for every chapter. So you're going to want to write down who the POV character was. You're going to want to write down other characters, creatures, groups, or objects that, occur or show up in that chapter. You're going to want to keep track of the locations. And you're going to want to create a summary, very short, of what happened in that chapter. So kind of breaking that down, point of view character. Who is the point of view character for the chapter? Typically, you're probably going to only have one. It just makes it easy to track if you are switching point of view characters between your chapters. You want to write down their physical description and their costume description. What do they look like? If they're constantly changing their outfits, it's very useful to keep track of what your character looks like and when they look like that. It's also great to keep track of important objects or tools that the character uses. I typically write fantasy, so keeping track of the weapons that they have, maybe the amount of money that they have, other things that people give them during the chapter. It's very useful to know when they have something and when they don't. The next section, I like to keep track of the other characters, creatures, groups, and objects that are in that chapter. So what I do is I list all of the named characters in that chapter. So I list both their names and their descriptions. I keep track of any creatures, fantasy or otherwise, that appear. Again, I write fantasy, so this is very, very useful for me to keep track of, which magical creatures are showing up in the chapter and what they look like and how I describe them. I keep track of groups or organizations that appear or are mentioned. It's very useful to keep track of those names and who's involved in those groups as well. I also list any important objects that are directly used or mentioned. If my character, is handed a book or given money or something else important happens, I want to keep track of those things, and it's very useful to know when those things showed up in my story. The next thing I keep track of are the locations. For the locations, I like to list the name of the location where the action takes place in the chapter. So anytime that something changes, I will list that as a separate location, and I add descriptions that include important setting details. If I come back to those locations, it's very useful to remember how I described them and maybe some of the actual word-for-word descriptions that I used so I can remain consistent. Books typically have a lot of unique locations, and keeping track of setting details, like I mentioned, it does help if the character returns to the location more than once. So that way, you're not running into major inconsistencies in your settings. And then the chapter summary. So in a single paragraph, describe the events of the chapter. I try to keep it to 2 or 3 sentences. If it's a longer chapter or something very complex happens or I'm setting something up, I will leave myself a few notes. That can be very useful. I also like to include any important incidents, conflicts, or resolutions. So if I set something up in a few chapters and there is a resolution, I do like to keep track of that as well. And it's just kind of, again, the whole point of this is to, keep track of what you've written and where, so that way the revision process is much easier. One thing I started doing as well is highlighting any specific quotes or lines that stuck out to me from the chapter. This is something that's fun for me to do. It has also been very useful when I'm trying to come up with descriptions for the book. So that's something that's also been very helpful. So this is sort of the template. this is what I have created to keep track of everything. And I kind of have created either this in a Word doc or a Google document. You can even create it in like a spreadsheet. But each of the points are there. So I have the chapter title, the point of view character, and in that box I add all of the information about that character. In the next box, I keep track of the other characters, creatures, groups, objects, and I put that all together. And then I have the box for locations, and then the summary box. And then I create one of these for every single chapter that I do. And I think it would be really cool to sort of demonstrate what I've done. So let me pull up my other screen and show you exactly how I implemented this for one of my books. All right, so pulling this up, this is the chapter outline and summary that I created for my first book, Child of Fire. So in the first section, you can see the chapter title is my prologue. My point of view character is Caden. It's in first person, so my point of view character doesn't change in that book, but I still kept track of that. And then I added descriptions, not only of his mood and how people perceived him, but later on I did add descriptions of what he was wearing, and so I do keep track of those details. And then the characters, I put them in bold of the ones that are named, and then I add the descriptions that I actually use in the chapter, keep track of the creatures that show up as well. I keep track of the locations, anything that's also mentioned, so if they refer to a specific location, I would keep track of that as well. And then I created a summary, so you can see the few sentences that I created explaining what the chapter was about, and then I added like a few other comments of things that I referenced, descriptions that I did, a certain style of cursing that takes place in the book. And that helps me as I'm trying to be consistent throughout the book. It's much easier to keep track of these things and reference them than to constantly go through page after page and reread everything. So this kind of gives you that bird's eye view, and just scrolling down you can see, I did this for every chapter. And you end up with a document that, can be quite long, but at the end of the day, it's like if I want to know what happens to a character, or I want to search that character, I can more easily find exactly what I referenced and when I referenced it. So that way, if I do need to make edits or I need to revisit things, I can go back to that chapter and reread it without having to hunt for it. This was extremely useful, and I'm very glad that I did this method because when it came to writing book 2 and book 3, I had this reference guide that I could keep going back to. It helped a ton with remaining consistent, and I didn't feel like I was constantly having to go flip open my first 2 books, searching for how I described somebody or described a location or even how I spelled the name. It was very, very easy to keep track of things. I found this to be a very useful practice. So I hope that in some way that this can help you keep track of your stories and be a better writer. Thank you so much for watching this video. Leave a comment, like, subscribe, and stay tuned for other helpful videos in the future.